Okay, so this time you've given us a pretty fascinating set of materials to dive into.
Oh, yeah.
Um, we're going deep into immigration law today,
Sounds good.
and specifically looking at two things that I have to admit before we even really get going.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know a ton about, so this will be a learning experience for me too. I think a lot of our listeners will be in the same boat.
I think so.
We're looking at administrative stays of removal and EB2-NIW petitions.
Right.
Um, and I guess our goal today really is to kind of unpack these two legal tools
Yeah.
for our listeners and figure out how they work.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe more importantly, like when they're relevant.
When they're useful.
Yeah, when are these the right tools to use?
Exactly.
Particularly for people who might be facing deportation or trying to get permanent residency in the U.S. based on, their work being in the national interest.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like, from the sources you sent over, we're getting a perspective that's really interesting. It's from immigration attorneys who are like in the trenches dealing with these things every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really interesting about the sources is that they go beyond just the kind of textbook, like this is what the law is.
Right.
And they really get into the strategic considerations,
Oh, interesting.
how you actually use these tools in a real world scenario.
Okay, so let's jump right in then. The first thing that kind of jumps out at me from the material is this idea of an administrative stay of removal.
Okay.
And for someone facing like the very real possibility of being deported,
Right.
this sounds like a huge first step, a first line of defense.
It is. It really is.
And it's described as temporary, but it feels like it could be such a crucial moment
Oh, absolutely.
in someone's case.
Think of an administrative stay of removal as like hitting the pause button
Okay,
on deportation.
got it.
So it doesn't mean that like everything's fine now and you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Right.
But it does mean that like they can't deport you right this second.
Okay.
And that gives you time to like figure things out.
Okay.
To file more paperwork to work on your case.
So who actually, who has the power to hit that pause button?
So it could be a couple different places.
Okay.
It could be ICE,
Okay.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement,
Got it.
or it could be the BIA,
What's BIA?
the Board of Immigration Appeals.
Okay, and is it like, do you know ahead of time which one it's going to be, or is that part of the process?
It depends on where you are in the whole process, like how far along your case is and stuff.
Okay, so for the person who's,
Sure.
facing this, what's the benefit of getting one of these stays?
Well, I mean, the most obvious benefit is that you don't get deported,
Okay.
like immediately, right?
Yeah.
But it also lets you stay in the country legally
Right.
while you're fighting your case.
That makes sense.
Because if you get deported, you have to like do everything from outside the country.
Right. Which seems like a nightmare.
Yeah, and it's hard to like meet with your lawyer.
Right.
It's hard to like gather evidence and stuff.
So it's not just like a logistical thing. It sounds like there's a huge emotional benefit
Oh yeah, definitely.
to being able to stay put.
Like, can you imagine being forced to leave the country
Right.
and then like having to deal with all this legal stuff from somewhere else?
And probably not even being able to like see your family or anything.
Exactly. It's just a huge mess.
Yeah.
So the stay can really help with all that.
Okay, so the materials you sent over really highlighted some specific situations where this stay becomes
Right.
absolutely crucial. Like,
Like a lifeline.
yeah. Can you walk us through a few of those?
Sure. So like one example is if you have an appeal that's still pending
Okay,
or like a waiver application that they're still looking at,
makes sense.
it wouldn't be fair to deport you while they're still deciding on that stuff.
Right.
Another situation is if you think that you were deported unfairly,
Okay.
like if there was some kind of mistake in your case.
Right, like a procedural error or something.
Exactly. And then the stay gives you time to try and fix that.
Okay.
And then the last one that they talked about a lot in materials was like humanitarian reasons. So this would be like if you have a really serious medical condition
Right.
that needs treatment here in the U.S.
That makes sense.
or if being deported would like really harm your family or something like that.
Okay, so it's like a safety net
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's like
right.
a last resort in a lot of cases.
for some really difficult situations.
hmm
Okay, so we've talked about how important this is for the person who's facing deportation.
Right.
But the materials also talk about why it's so important for the lawyers,
Yes.
for the immigration attorneys who are working on these cases.
Yeah, I mean, for a lawyer, a stay of removal is like the first thing you want to try and get
Okay.
because it buys you time.
Right.
And time is like the most valuable thing in these cases.
Why is that?
Because you need time to like really investigate the case,
Okay.
to talk to witnesses, to gather evidence,
Right.
to do all the stuff you need to do to build a strong defense.
Okay.
And you can't do any of that if your client's already been deported.
So it really does sound like it's like the most crucial first step.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, so that's administrative stays.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's switch gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about EB2-NIW petitions. This is a totally different thing, right?
It is, yeah.
This is for people who are trying to get permanent residency
Right.
by proving that their work benefits the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And the key here, it seems like, is that it's not enough to just describe what you do.
Yeah.
You have to really demonstrate how your work helps the country.
Exactly. Like just saying I'm a software engineer isn't going to cut it.
Right.
You have to show how your specific skills and experience are going to benefit the U.S.
And like, how do you actually prove that?
Well, that's where it gets tricky.
Yeah.
USCIS, they want to see evidence.
USCIS being
United States Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Yeah.
They want to see like concrete proof that your work is important.
Okay, so the material you sent over it had some really interesting and specific advice about how to do this.
Yes, it did.
And the first thing they talked about was being super specific about what you actually do. It's
Right.
like your proposed endeavor, I think they called it.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean?
So like, let's say your client develops AI tools for healthcare.
Okay.
You can't just say that.
Right.
You have to get into the nitty-gritty.
Like what kinds of things?
It's like, what specific AI models are they developing?
Okay.
What kind of data are they using?
Okay.
How are they going to actually use these tools in the real world?
Interesting.
And then most importantly, how is this going to benefit people?
So it's like painting a really clear picture for
Exactly.
USCIS.
Yeah.
So they're not just left guessing.
Right, because USCIS, they're not going to make any assumptions.
Got it.
You have to spell everything out for them.
Okay, the next thing they talked about was providing evidence of past impact.
Yes.
So not just saying like, oh, I'm a leader in my field,
Right.
but actually showing it.
Exactly.
So what does that look like?
So, like, if you've given presentations at conferences or published papers in journals,
Right.
you need to explain what those presentations and papers were about. Interesting.
And more importantly, what kind of impact they had.
So, like, did it change the way people do things?
Right, like did it lead to new discoveries or new technologies?
Interesting.
Or did it influence policy decisions or anything like that?
So it's not just about listing your accomplishments.
No.
It's about explaining how those accomplishments actually made a difference.
Exactly.
Okay, the next thing was aligning your work with U.S. national priorities.
Yes. This is a big one.
So what does that mean?
So like the U.S. government has all these different goals and objectives,
Right.
like improving healthcare,
Okay.
protecting the environment,
Yeah.
advancing scientific research, stuff like that.
Right.
And you need to show how your work is going to help the U.S. achieve those goals.
So it's like showing how your work fits into the bigger picture.
Exactly.
About what the country's trying to do.
Right.
Okay. And then the last thing they mentioned was highlighting your unique role and qualifications.
Yes. This is where you get to brag a little bit.
You want to show why you're the best person to do this work.
Right.
Like maybe you have a special skill or a unique perspective,
Yeah.
or maybe you've invented something groundbreaking.
Got it.
Whatever it is, you need to make it clear that you're not just some random person off the street.
Right.
You're someone who can really make a difference.
Okay, so it seems like the big takeaway here is that specificity is key.
Oh, absolutely.
You can't just be vague or general.
No, you have to be very precise in detail.
And provide evidence to back up everything you say.
Exactly, because USCIS, they're not going to just take your word for it.
Right, you have to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap things up for our listener,
Okay.
what are the key things they should remember from all this?
All right, so if you're facing deportation,
Yeah,
know that a stay of removal exists.
got it.
It can buy you time to fight your case.
Okay.
And if you're applying for an EB2-NIW,
Yeah.
be as specific as possible.
Okay.
Show how your work will benefit the U.S.
And provide evidence?
Lots of evidence.
Okay, so we've talked about how both of these things, a stay of removal and an EB2-NIW,
Right.
they both depend on these really specific legal processes.
Mm-hmm.
And they involve a lot of back and forth with immigration authorities.
Mm.
So what does that tell us about the immigration system as a whole?
Well, I think it shows that it's a very complex system.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to navigate.
Definitely not.
And that's why it's so important to have a good lawyer.
That's a good point.
Someone who knows the ins and outs of the system
Yeah.
and who can help you present your case in the best possible light.
That's great advice. Thanks for walking us through all this.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
I think our listeners learned a lot today.
I hope so.
All right, that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.